Hello, everyone. My name is Vishnu, and with me today is Amar.
Hello.
And welcome to the UDOS podcast. This is the podcast where we talk about things that you may not know enough about. So, today we're going to talk about something that's pretty important that happened quite recently, which is the Olympics. Now, most of us know the Olympics for being the biggest sports event that happens in the world every 4 years. But there's a very big problem with the Olympics that goes unnoticed more often than not, or we do not give it the recognition it deserves, which is doping. Doping is basically taking any substances to improve your performance in sports. This could be like drugs, hormones that give you an unfair advantage over another athlete participating in the sport. So, what we're going to talk about today is essentially how doping came about, why it exists, and the problems with the bodies that are supposed to prevent doping from happening in the first place. So, let's answer the first question. Why does the usage of doping in sports happen? Why are drugs used in sports, basically? So, we can pin it down to three reasons. The first is the Cold War. So many of us know that the Cold War is basically a war that is fought indirectly between the US and Russia. So there's no direct military confrontation, but they fought the war in various other methods. For example, who won the race to the moon? Which army has greater might? And also, in this case, through sports. So whichever country had obtained the most number of medals was seen to be the winner of the Cold War. So, in order to compete and perform better than the other country, Russia had opted in, maybe US as well, but it's unreported more often than not. A lot of Russian athletes had opted in to taking these drugs, or the Russian government had organized programs to make all of its athletes take these drugs. So they didn't just give them usual drugs. Maybe the government had done a lot of research and development to improve like the substances that they're giving to the athletes, so it's not traced and the athletes can get their goals without any problems. That's the first reason. The second reason why doping happens is also because of national pride. So, for example, with Russia, Russia has a bad history when it comes to humanitarian rights. In order to clear up that image, some countries or even companies attempt to do something called sports washing, where they improve their performances in other avenues, for example, in sports by doing better on the pitch or doing better on the track and field in order to cover up their image as being a very bad country. So, this is important because one, it takes a lot of pressure off of the bad humanitarian rights that they have. Two is that by breaking all of these records, it fuels the national pride and identity that people have. For example, when Russia wins a lot of gold medals, people feel more confident and they feel a sense of patriotism for their country. So countries like Russia, in this case, were very focused on creating this national pride and making everybody feel that same sense of patriotism. The third reason is for individual reasons. For example, as any athlete, you just want to do well, right? So if you want to do well, you will do anything that is on the table for you to win a certain event or like get the gold medal. For example, like Lance Armstrong, he won a lot of his Tour de France's by doping. There was the Festina affair where like a taxi driver was pulled over having a lot of hormones and like drugs that were supposed to be given to cyclists. So athletes do this because if you win the gold medal or you win certain events, you get a lot more exposure, you get a lot of money, you get a lot of brand deals, a lot of recognition. So this is why some athletes do it on an individualistic level. So these are the reasons why a lot of athletes opt into doping. Now, Amma, talk to me about the solution to the problem of doping.
Okay, so as far as solutions go, this is probably the only one that's really in existence in the current status quo. So the International Olympic Committee, or IOC for short, we'll be using a lot of abbreviations, right? So IOC for short created WADA, or the World Anti-Doping Agency. Now, like any other figure of authority in anything really, WADA is independent, right? The reason is very simple. You want to avoid a conflict of interest with IOC. Now, because fundamentally the reason IOC exists is to make money, to promote its events, promote its sports events all across the world, right? Olympic is one of the biggest sporting events in the world to date, and there has to be some amount of capital they can gain from it. And that's probably why it exists, one of the main reasons, right? Now, if they control WADA, for the sake of making sports more exciting, they are more than likely to completely overlook drug usage. because it makes things interesting. Records are broken, the champion is challenged by the underdog out of the blue. Becomes very fun, very nice to watch. But, so for all those reasons, it's unlikely to be good if IOC were in control of this particular committee. Now, theoretically, this seems like a decent solution, but there are a number of problems with this independence that WADA has gotten. The main being that, funnily enough, even though IOC were the ones that created WADA, IOC ended up feeling uncomfortable and feeling that WADA is encroaching its organization in some way because, obviously for WADA to do its job as efficiently and as well as possible, they need to have access to some amount of information from IOC that previously was private and confidential, right? So that's one. And secondly, they felt that to some extent, it would end up impacting their financial status either directly or indirectly. But in regards to the problems that WADA has had, we'll talk about that a little bit more later on, right? So now let's talk about what actually WADA did. And the first is the World Anti-Doping Code, which is what they created. Very simply, there are a standardized number of rules on doping, right? So this came about because a lot of countries usually have some different version of doping rules that they use within their country. So this standard rules made it much more difficult for any country to cheat per se, right? This means that documentation becomes globalized. Every single major sporting event can now be used as a reference, right? To see what exactly is allowed, what isn't. That's a very good thing. They investigate what drugs people use as well, right? What's new, what's with the times, so to put it, right? And this allows them to, number one, cooperate with pharmaceutical companies or pharma industries, big pharmas, to understand what are the latest drugs that are being used by athletes that could potentially boost performance and what are their side effects so that we can better identify them, right? So all of this seems very, very good, right? But to really understand what kind of impact it's had, we really need to understand how it works in the first place. How does WADA work? So Vishnu, back to you.
All right. So let's first talk about funding of WADA. Now, Amma mentioned earlier that WADA is independent from IOC. That is true. But I'm going to show to you how, even though WADA is meant to be independent, it is not. Firstly, WADA has a budget of about $37 million US. On a first impression, it sounds like a lot, but we need to keep in mind, WADA is in charge of enforcing the anti-doping code around the world. So we're going to talk about 37 million to enforce doping in like 180 plus countries around the world where there are like more than 50 to 100 different types of sports events that happen. 37 million doesn't sound like a lot when you break it down that much. So firstly, WADA has a very small budget. So what are the problems if you have a small budget? If you have a small budget, that means you can't do your tests properly. If you can't do your tests properly, that means you're not impactful enough in detecting doping that occurs. That means you are not effective enough in identifying athletes who dope. And the outcome of this is, let's just say you're WADA or you're working for WADA and you are running on a low budget and if you continuously test on a very tight budget and you can't identify athletes, you feel less encouraged in order to carry this out because it's futile, because you're not getting the athletes who are carrying out doping. A lot of athletes in the Olympics have come out and said like, I have taken drugs, but none of them have been caught, or a very few amount of them have been caught. We're going to put a video in the description, so a lot of my statements are backed up there. The second thing is that WADA is heavily understaffed. That means they do not have enough staff to carry out doping across the world and across certain regions, which makes their job even more difficult. Next, let's talk about this budget in a bit more detail. So 37 million comes from two stakeholders. The first is all the country members of IOC. That means there's like about 100 plus countries that are a member of IOC, and they provide 50% of 37 million. The other 50% of 37 million comes from IOC. So there's a big problem here, because if IOC is funding WADA, then they can influence WADA. If they influence WADA, there's a conflict of interest. So this could look like, for example, if WADA is enforcing doping codes very strictly and encroaching on like IOC data, IOC doesn't feel comfortable. So if IOC doesn't feel comfortable, they would reduce the budget that's given to WADA. Now, WADA needs a budget. They already have a pretty small budget, right? So if WADA doesn't cooperate with IOC, their budget will be reduced significantly lower, which means that they cannot enforce doping in the future. So WADA is at a dead end. they have to cooperate with IOC. If not, they will not get any more funding to enforce doping. It's a very bad situation for WADA to be stuck in between. Now, this causes another problem with this whole funding stuff, which is that if WADA has very little funding, they cannot do their testing right. So let's look at this in a bit more detail. If you don't have enough funding to carry out the tests, like firstly, you can't even have labs to do the testing, right? Because you don't have the manpower, you don't have the equipment, the substances in order to detect all these drugs. So what does WADA do to carry out these doping tests? What WADA does is that they accredit labs in other countries. Let me give you an example, for instance. Let's just say Russia hosted the Olympics, right? And when Russia hosts the Olympics, Russian scientists are the ones who are going to be testing the doping samples from various athletes. Because WADA doesn't have enough resources to bring scientists or testers from other countries, so they have to trust the Russian testers. So what this looks like is the Russian labs will be WADA verified. Like you'll have a sign which is like WADA verified. That's it. WADA can't do anything else. So whenever this testing occurs, these Russian testers will produce these results, right? And when they produce these results, WADA has no choice but to just take it as it is, because they don't have the resources to double check or to investigate whether these people have a conflict of interest as well. A very big problem that happened the last Olympics is that Russian testers were cutting holes in the walls and they were swapping samples with people. So imagine if Russia had hosted their own Olympics, what this would look like, right? You get the picture where a lot of conflict of interest would happen and doping would just go completely under the radar. The last problem with WADA that we need to understand is that WADA cannot punish athletes. They can only recommend actions to be taken against athletes or countries. We always want to go back to Russia because it's the most prominent example. So Russia was caught having this doping scandal, and they had whistleblowers that came out. So they had a leading government figure, if I'm not mistaken, who was in charge of running this program. And he became a whistleblower, and he revealed a lot of this data and information about how Russia wanted to dope their athletes on a governmental program. That means Russia ran the show on doping all of its athletes, right? So when this happened and this data got to WADA, WADA had recommended a sanction, which is to ban Russia from taking part in the Olympics for X number of years or for a very long time. The problem is, when WADA recommends a punishment, if Russia doesn't agree, then this punishment will be deliberated at a court. The court is called Court of Arbitration of Sports, or CAS for short. The problem with this court is that this court is heavily influenced by IOC. So for instance, if Russia is getting prosecuted by CAS, Russia will get its sentence severely reduced because IOC and Russia cooperate a lot more. We're going to talk about this in a future video. Basically, Russia and IOC work together, right? That's what you need to know for now. If you want to go and look up for more information, go ahead, feel free. So what happened right now is that WADA recommended the heavy punishment on Russia, and that sentence got heavily reduced in these courts. So even though WADA wanted to punish these countries, the sentences went very light, and that means no countries will feel the repercussions of participating. Like right now, Russian athletes participate under a new flag, but in the next Olympics, they can participate as Russia again. So no retribution happening there, or no impactful retribution. One last thing though, let's talk about Russia a bit more again. Russia is a very closed country. Closed country meaning that there's not a lot of information that comes out of Russia and goes into Russia. So if WADA wants to investigate Russia for carrying out doping, it's extremely difficult to obtain this information. So if you can't get this information, then you are prosecuting the Russian country or the Russian athletes inappropriately because you don't have the data to punish them, or you don't have the evidence to punish them equitably. So these are all of the problems that WADA has. Now, Amma, what I need you to do for me is to show me the impacts of all of these problems that WADA has with them.
Right. Okay. So let's go back to what we talked about a little bit earlier, which was the IOC conflict of interest. Now, IOC created WADA, had it be an independent body, yet they are probably the source of most of WADA's problems. right? So let's first go a bit deeper into the IOC's interest, right? Now, we established they want to earn money and they want to host one of the biggest sporting events in the world, which means they need a lot of things. They need a huge amount of volunteers. They need incredibly large infrastructure. They need a lot. So it is more than likely that big or wealthy countries are going to end up hosting the Olympics, like Russia or the US, big countries that have that amount of infrastructure, that level of monetary availability, I guess would be the word for it, right?
Yeah.
So let's take Russia as an example. Russia were to have a doping scandal, for example. Now, say they give every single one of their athletes drugs. I don't know, okay? Let's just put it out there for now.
Yeah.
Now, what could happen is WADA could call each and every one of them out and do whatever appropriate punishment they have. But the problem is, IOC still needs them to host it, to fund the infrastructure, to get supporters for the event, to get volunteers. So in cases like this, IOC has to let it slide. So what happens there, in the interest of earning money and hosting these games, in the interest of reputation, whatever accountability factor essentially flies out the window, which means the athletes involved in this end up not getting punished or getting severely reduced sentences, like you mentioned earlier, Vishnu. Another thing is that former IOC members end up holding very, very important positions in WADA. This is in part because they are financing it to a very large extent, right? So that again brings up the problem of the conflict of interest, right, with IOC. Now, here's another thing that becomes very important. I believe this is a situation that exists in either basketball or baseball where the teams are considered almost brotherhoods, right? And if you were to speak out against a member of the team to accuse them of whatever, doping or whatever, you're more than likely to be ostracized not just within the team, but within the entire sport. Now, because of this lack of budget, an institution like WADA cannot do enough to protect these whistleblowers, even though they may be right, cannot have proper investigations, so they end up risking their entire careers just to have something like that. And this is in large because WADA is already involved in a lot of politics. Which is funny because that principle in itself sort of goes against a lot of the principles that sports already exist. That already exist about sports. And if you can't protect these whistleblowers, if you can't maintain this honesty, you're going to get less info about doping scandals, so on and so forth, because people won't want to risk their own careers. So again, defeats the purpose of their entire existence, right? Now, here's the thing to remember about sports, right? As a whole, sports is supposed to be something fair, equitable, without having any politics. You want to see stories of underdogs beating the grand champions through sheer effort, the excitement of it. Now, this very concept just completely opposes that, because if you're an underdog, right, and you work and end up going up against the best in your sport, and you lose not because they are better than you, but because they end up taking drugs, that's incredibly unfair to you, right? So for all we know, a smaller country could end up challenging a superior country, not beat them, and then the entire excitement of that underdog versus top dog just sort of disappears in sports as well. So all in all, WADA can't really do anything if they are tied to IOC in any way, be it through funding, through having members involved in it, because they're not able to enforce their own rules. So now the question comes about, in what ideal world would WADA operate at its peak efficiency to be able to uphold the rules of fair sport? Vishnu?
All right. So let's first understand what the best version of WADA looks like.
Yeah.
Firstly, to have the best version of WADA, it needs a lot of funding. It needs enough staff members, and it can act independently. So WADA acts independently now, but we're going to talk about it in a more realistic sense. That means WADA can actually punish people. They can enforce bans. They can enforce penalties. And there's very little ability to challenge these decisions in courts of arbitration and stuff like that. WADA should be able to investigate these countries, and they do not need to report to the IOC, because if you report to the IOC, then your conflict of interest exists. So removing that makes WADA a bit better. Also, WADA will need to cooperate with other organizations much more. For example, cooperating with national sports institutions which they can trust, with greater information that's being exchanged between parties. That is the best world that WADA looks in. So a lot of funding, acting independently, they don't need to report to IOC, they can investigate by themselves, and they can have a lot of cooperation. So even though WADA can exist in this best version of itself, there's still a lot of problems with WADA. Firstly, funding has to always come from somebody. So if the funding were to come mainly from a new country, then WADA will have to pander towards those countries. So let's just say Russia funds WADA. If Russia funds WADA and Russian athletes dope, WADA has to turn a blind eye to that, which means that WADA is not enforcing its principles of preventing doping from occurring. That's the first. Second is that if Russia gets involved with doping again, then they are basically politicizing sports. Amma mentions later that sports is celebrated because it's not politicized, right? It's a platform where everybody can get together and enjoy these athletes perform for something they've worked on so hard to represent their countries. If Russia is going to heavily fund WADA, you bring back these elements of politics which don't allow sports to stand for what it should be, which is a non-political agenda. Next problem. So, in order for WADA to carry out these investigations, they need the cooperation from countries like Russia. We've already mentioned how Russia is a pretty close country. And if Russia is a pretty close country, they are less likely to cooperate with these investigations. So let's just say US funds WADA and they need to investigate Russia for doping allegations. If Russia realizes that WADA wants to do these investigations, there's going to be a lot of pushback. So Russia's going to disagree. They're going to insult like the WADA committee for like threatening their country's integrity, sovereignty, etc., etc. And what's going to happen is there's going to be a lot of pushback to WADA. So if WADA has a lot of pushback, less countries are willing to cooperate with it in the long term. So this takes our cooperation out of the window. The next thing is that as of right now, WADA doesn't have a lot of representatives from every country. So maybe some countries have more dominant representatives for like the US, but not other countries. So for example, if you have a remote country like Tajikistan or Kyrgyzstan, they don't have their representatives in WADA. This is important because WADA doesn't have a diverse pool of staff to dish out like punishments equitably. So there can be some biasness that exists in WADA. The last thing that is very important. So let's just say WADA has a lot of funding from a unilateral party. Everybody cooperates with them. They can dish out punishments. But let's just say they go to the courts. And the problem with these laws is that if one country is fighting a case against WADA, these countries have a way bigger budget, right? Like I don't think at any point in time WADA has the budget to challenge a country. So what we're going to look at is a world where these countries can hire much better lawyers to fight for their cases, to look for loopholes within the laws because of the subjectivity of this doping code. Now what happens is the best athletes and the most well-funded athletes will go scot-free. The countries which put a lot of money in these sporting agendas of doping their athletes will go scot-free. So even if WADA were to exist in its best version, there are still a lot of problems that exist with WADA. That is not to say that WADA is useless. WADA is important, but the problem is that even though WADA serves a very good intention, there are a lot of strings attached to WADA that makes it very difficult to function as an entity to protect the sovereignty, not the sovereignty, to protect the spirit of the game, to protect the spirit of sports, of being fair to everyone, an equal playing field, to be entertaining to all individuals.
Yeah. So it's funny how you mentioned that, because like a lot of times when we go for debates about any particular topic, we're always taking a much harder stance whether we are supporting it or opposing it. But in most cases, the real world applicable solution would be any middle ground that you have. So in most cases, even in this case in particular, the best middle ground we could possibly achieve is having funding with no strings attached and having at least some basis of cooperation within the countries involved in it. But Vishnu, do you think we will ever get to that? It would be possible to ever get to that world realistically?
I think the closest world to have bipartisan WADA is all the countries that are involved have to increase their funding. So right now, let's just say the budget's 37 million and countries commit like 50%, which is what, 19.5 or 18.5, somewhere around there. I think every individual country needs to just give a lot more money towards this budget that WADA holds. Because if all the countries give a bigger budget collectively, then you don't have a bias that exists from one country. That is like the first world that I can think of. The
Yeah.
second is that I feel that WADA should aim to remove as much strings from IOC, because the more strings that WADA has attached to IOC, the more complicated things get, and that's where your conflict of interest happens.
Mm.
So if WADA can aim to employ heads or like figures of authority that are not from IOC, have no history with them, that'll be really great moving forward.
Yeah. See, that's an interesting world to. Maybe we could even look forward to it one day. We'll see how it goes.
We'll see. We'll
Yep.
see. So there you have it. That is the session where we talked about doping, especially in the Olympics. Huge shout out to Vice News. Link is in the description talking about this in a bit more detail. There are a lot more nuances about the Russian whistleblower and how Russia tried to carry out their doping scandal. And you can see a lot of the athletes talk about it and how they were pushed into these circumstances because every other athlete was doing it.
Yeah.
Go watch the video, you'll enjoy it.
Yep.
And yeah, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like it, click the like button twice. Please give us a subscribe. Please subscribe to our channel. Comment if there's anything you'd like to talk about. Follow our socials. And thank you. See you next time.
Thank you.